What I want to do today is to talk about one aspect of brain science on the schedule. I was given a title that let me talk about anything about the science of the brain, but I thought I would talk about something that is a public health issue. It's an issue in every community, and it is the mechanisms in the brain of drug addiction. And of course we study these things at the molecular level, partly to understand maybe better ways of prevention, but above all to come up with better treatments than we now have. So the other thing to be said is, if I start, babbling in jargon, somebody please stop me. When I teach medical students, if they ever complain, I just, all I have to say is it's going to be on the test, and then they they focus. Here I actually have to be clear and lucid, so please don't be bashful. Okay, so this is a picture of an opium poppy, and this is what we are now dealing with, for example, in Afghanistan. The flower is gone. This is a seed pod. And if you make an incision in the seed pod and wait a bit and come back, there's a sort of a gelatinous, a gummy substance that forms. That's raw opium that people used to smoke. And then in the 19th century, chemists purified components of this raw opium, and among the components were something called morphine, and it was considered very important because there are not a lot of drugs that we had in the 19th century that we still use today. In fact, almost none, and morphine is one of them. It remains a very, very important drug to treat pain. And if anyone's had surgery or broken leg, you may or may not have had morphine, but you've had drugs in this family. There's only one, well, more than one, but there's one major problem with these otherwise miraculous drugs to treat pain, which is some people who take them find that they can't stop taking them, that they crave them, that they need them, and they will disrupt their whole life. We'll come back to this in a second, to get more of these drugs. So again, in the 19th century, the strongest universities in the world were actually mostly in Germany, and they were focused on science. The Germans took care of that themselves around the period of World War II, where they exported most of their faculty. But in the 19th century, German chemistry was really very powerful, and chemists, tried to deal with the morphine problem. And one thing they did is they modified morphine. They put two chemical groups, acetyl groups, on morphine, and they came up with the heroic solution to the morphine problem named heroin. Oops, that didn't quite solve the problem. And over time, chemists have tried to come up with several other non-addictive opiates. One was Demerol. Oops, that didn't work either. And the truth is, the problem really isn't solved. We really can't separate analgesia from this peculiar property of dependence. But here's an interesting question. It gets you thinking. So how is it that a natural plant product can come to control human behavior? How is that possible? And why opium and not broccoli or something, right? What is it? And this opens up a scientific mystery, right? What is it in this innocent-looking seed pod that can come to control human behavior? Okay, so let me define the problem. The problem is drug addiction, and the definition of addiction that we all use is based not so much on physical symptoms, because some addictive drugs like cocaine don't produce withdrawal symptoms like opiates or alcohol. but on this strange phenomenon of compulsion. How do we think about compulsion? Well, compulsion means people continue to use a substance despite significantly negative consequences. So let me tell you a story, a true story about another very addictive drug, tobacco, and the story of a doctor. And the reason that I want to tell you a story about a doctor who I actually knew, and it tells you when people get addicted, right, the power of this is he knew everything about tobacco. He knew exactly that, you know, the medical consequences of smoking. He also studied and knew about addiction. And yet this knowledge wasn't enough. So he kept smoking, and one of the effects of tobacco smoke is it leads to atherosclerosis, which is the development of fatty plaques in the blood vessels. And they affected first his legs. When he would walk, he would have no circulation. He would have to stop. So he got surgery, and they replaced the blood vessels leading to his legs with Dacron grafts, Dacron hoses. Well, he said, I'm going to quit now. This is the warning, but he couldn't. And then the main vessel leading out of the heart, the aorta, developed the same thing. It started to expand. He almost died. He ended up with a Dacron aorta as well. He developed emphysema, which gave him shortness of breath. And again, in his cold cognition, right, what he knew in his head, he can say, you know, why can't I stop smoking? Now, of course, a lot of people can, but we all have different things we bring to the table in terms of genetic and other risk factors, and this guy obviously was just owned by addictive drugs. And I could go on and on, but in the end he died of lung cancer, right? So how is it, again, tobacco, it's a natural plant product, right? How is it? What's in it? How does it control human behavior? Well, that's an example, though, of compulsion, right? This guy knew, I've got to stop. He tried to cut down again and again and again. And what happened, which is typical, is he would quit, he would detoxify himself, right? And then he would either have a really stressful period and right back again, or there's something really interesting that happens in addiction. Cues, reminders of prior drug use. So there'd be circumstance in which he would naturally always smoke. So we just passed Thanksgiving. So after Thanksgiving dinner, right, big festive meal, you know, I gotta light up. So reminders of drug use. Some people who have been treated for heroin addiction will often, the drug-associated cues may be their friends, right? Or it may be the smell of somebody, you know, cooking heroin in a spoon. But whatever, these reminders start use all over again, and especially for drugs with a physical withdrawal syndrome, where there are bodily symptoms like opiates, like alcohol for some people. You know, people who have gone through the tortures of the damned getting detoxified. So it's not like they have made a plan. Gee, that was really terrific at rehab. I love the abdominal pain, or I love the shakes, and I'd love to do it again, right? But they find themselves using again. So what is this in our brains that makes us vulnerable? That's really the question. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the brain. So this is just a side view of the human brain. So it's like you're looking into my brain, you know, just sliced from the nose to the back. You're looking at a side view. Here's the nose. It's actually not my nose. Here's the forehead. Here's the back of the brain. And the brain works by cells communicating with each other in complex computational circuits. But the story of addiction depends on a particular survival system, which I've shown you here, which uses a neurotransmitter, a chemical that cells use to talk to each other, called dopamine. Some of you have heard of dopamine, perhaps, because when some of these dopamine-making cells die, that's when we get Parkinson's disease. The part of the brain where the dopamine cells die to get Parkinson's disease is actually right next to this. I didn't draw it, but it's right next to this blue part. It's called the substantia nigra, which means black substance, because in a freshly cut brain section there's a little bit of black pigment. Okay, well, enough on Parkinson's. So this is, what do I mean by a survival circuit? Well, let me first, we'll come back to this in a second, but let's just take a little detour and talk about the role of emotion. And you'll see how this comes back in a bit. What is emotion? Normally when we think of emotion, we think of subjective feelings, right? Happy, sad, right? But emotion does a certain amount of work for us. Things that activate emotions are things that are important, that are relevant. If you think about it, all day long you're bombarded by an uncountable number of sensory stimuli, lights, sounds, smells, touch, people walking by. You don't pay attention to most of them. In fact, if you did, you'd just be dazzled all the time. And of the things you pay attention to, you remember even fewer, right? What's making that selection? Well, what makes the selection is what's important, right? What connects either to prior experience or what seems like it will matter to you, okay? So a well-known form of emotion is fear, right? In response to a threat, right? Let's imagine that. Let's imagine that I'm here, and all of a sudden, Professor Lou is playing a practical joke on me, and one of his pet cobras just showed up. Okay. What would be happening in my brain and in my body besides being scared? Well, what do emotions do? They activate, they change my cognition, my arousal. Meaning what? Meaning that when something really important is happening, when there's an alarm, I go from being drowsy to being really alert, right? Really awake. I'm paying rapt attention to that thing, right? I'm really focused. I'm not, oh, that's a nice picture, right? I'm absolutely focused. In my body, my physiology is altered. That is, I'm releasing stress hormones, and what those stress hormones are going to do, and what's called my sympathetic nervous system, my fight or flight response is going to do, is that it's going to redirect the blood, for example, that's now digesting my picnic lunch, and move the blood to my thighs and my arms so that I can motor out of there or get ready for a fight. And it's going to make sure that the food that I was storing, tragically, of course, as fat, now is turned into glucose, simple sugar, in order for me to be able to fight or flee, okay? And then I also have certain automatic behaviors. In humans, these are hard to pick up, but there's a great automatic fear behavior. Prey species, deer or rabbits, what do they do when they're frightened? They freeze, right? So, and that's because often, they were out at dawn or dusk. This is an evolutionary tall tale, but it may even be true. They were out at dawn or dusk, and predator vision is better tuned to motion than to shape. So it actually is very adaptive to freeze, right? Because there are enormous shadows and so forth. Of course, since the invention of the motor car, that's been less adaptive, right? But anyway, so to just review what I've said, so this emotion is not just a subjective feeling, right? It regulates my physiology, it regulates my behavior, it regulates my arousal, it regulates my cognition. Okay, that's on the threat side of the house. Well, there are also rewards. Let's imagine a world pre-McDonald's, pre-farming, okay? Most of us, we're starving most of the time, right? We were in a competition to get food, and one of the problems with having cheap, palatable fast food nearby is, I don't know about you, but I don't always do so well in But it really mattered, right? That if you, let's pretend we're a hunter-gatherer, that if you found a place where there were edible berries or a great place to hunt or to fish, right? That you remembered that, right? Just as, you know, when I used to, again, teach my medical students arcane things like neuroanatomy, right? They would have to rehearse it and rehearse it and rehearse it, right? And it just never stuck. It's really boring. But if I find something of survival relevance, I learn it right away, right? If there's a food supply in a time of hunger, I am really going to remember that, okay? And there's a part of the brain that's saying, you know, this is a priority. That was good. Let's do it again. Let's remember exactly how we did it. So that's true. These survival systems prioritize food, water or drink when you're thirsty, safety, and oh yes, sex, right? Because you know, if that were not, you know, sort of rewarding, if your brain didn't say that was good, let's do it again, this form of reproducing the species would not have been successful. You know, yeast just bud, right? You know, and they probably would have inherited the earth, right? There's got to be, for survival and continuation of the species, what has evolved are brain systems, again, say that was good, let's do it again, let's remember exactly how we did it. Well, it turns out that the dopamine system, this chemical in the brain, which is made deep in the brainstem, in the midbrain, and in the nerve cells, the neurons project, they send this messenger to all parts of the brain where they coordinate what's called reward. You know, that was good stuff. And I'm not showing you, but another part of the brain called the amygdala coordinates fear, okay? And this stuff is, we can study it really well because once evolution figured this out, it kept the same system. So this same kind of system exists in rodents and, you know, all kinds of animal species. Okay, so let me just introduce the players. This one has a really nice name. You see why no one remembers neuroanatomy. VTA stands for ventral tegmental area. Pretty catchy, right? NAC stands for the nucleus accumbens, which means the leaning nucleus. You don't have a quiz, so you don't have to remember those names. But it's really interesting. When dopamine gets released because you've just had a wonderful food, or you've just slaked a terrible thirst, or you've just won a contest, or whatever, I leave it to your imagination. When dopamine lands on the nucleus accumbens, it has an interesting job. Its job is to say, okay, let's learn the cues, what was going on that predicted this food supply? What was going on that predicted the water? What was going on that lets me find or predict where I can find safety? And it marks those sensory impressions. It marks them with what's called motivational salience, right? What does that mean? Well, just think about for a second again in your regular lives. Odors have different meanings, right? So they represent things. So there are some odors. If you smell a skunk, right, that odor is innately noxious, but it tells you, you know, be careful. Don't let the dog chase the black and white striped animal. Whatever it tells you, right? It has a meaning, okay? But imagine you're hungry and you pass a bakery and you smell freshly baked bread, or if I pass a barbecue and smell fresh grease, whatever. What happens, especially if I'm hungry, right? It has motivational value for me, right? It derails me. I was actually going to head off to do some, you know, arcane scholarship, but instead now this cue, this reminder, has diverted me into the bakery, okay? And that's what happens when dopamine interacts with the nucleus. And then up here, something that humans, this really differentiates from us from other mammals. I mean, all mammals have what's called a prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, but ours is enormous along with in contrast to other parts of our brains. And this is where we hold things like plans in our mind, consciously or even unconsciously. So when I decide, it's really remarkable what humans can do. I mean, you may take it for granted, but when I'm sitting in my office and I know I was going to come here in 2 hours, and I hold that plan in my mind and I show up and I give this lecture, that all involves the prefrontal cortex. Now, part of the prefrontal cortex, the part that sits right above your eyes, so it's called the orbital prefrontal cortex, is the place where we store the value of things. What does that mean? Well, let's think about it. So, every day I make my own lunch and bring it to work, and I always tell myself, how about a little bit of variety? But somehow when I look at what's in the fridge, I always take the tuna, right? Now, why is that? Well, there is encoded in my brain a relative set of values, right? Which is, tuna is better than, cheddar cheese is better than, that moldy roast beef. But it's actually these valuations are stored in your brain, and it sounds silly, but think about the number of sort of almost automatic choices you make during a day, right? You choose this rather than that, you take this route rather than that route, right? This is all represented in your brain. And dopamine, sneaky dopamine, has a big role in when we reorder our priorities. Now, why would that be, right? Well, because dopamine we've evolved so that, at least in the state of nature, but also I think today, things that are survival relevant are your first priority, right? When you're hungry, especially, right, that sort of elevates certain priorities. But if you're really hungry or you're really thirsty, that's what you're going to do first. You're not going to divert and do something else. Okay. All right. So here's a very famous, simple example, and then we'll come back to the paper. It's not often I can talk about a paper that was written in 1923, but Ivan Pavlov, okay, was a scientist who's actually interested, he's a Russian scientist, he's actually interested in digestion. But he discovered something really critical about behavior. And this again, this will just bring home the point about cues and motivational salience. So this dog innately, thinks that this is terrific, this is a steak. And the jargon term for this is an unconditioned stimulus, but he doesn't have to learn anything about this to want this. And he starts salivating, and his physiology, his digestive enzymes start working. But Pavlov, what he did is he rang a bell, something that had no meaning at all to the dog. And if he rang the bell at a fixed time interval before the steak appeared, pretty soon the bell came to represent the steak. And I think, as you all know, the dog now will salivate and get ready to eat when he hears the bell. And sometimes old Ivan would be sneaky. The steak wouldn't even appear, but the dog was already salivating. And we've seen this not only in our pets, but in ourselves, right? So the bell, what's happened? Well, the dog ate the steak, and dopamine was released. And then the bell predicted the steak, right? That's the whole point of these survival cues. And then the bell now got painted in the dog's brain, thanks to dopamine, with incentive salience. And now remember I said emotions are not only about thought, they're also feelings, they're also about behavior and physiology and thought. So now the bell, thanks to dopamine, is able to make the dog alert and focused and salivating, at least expecting the steak. Okay. Well, what does this have to do with drugs? And I apologize, just ignore this side of the slide. I should have asked Robin to genius at this. I should have asked him to remake my slides to be more palatable. So what about addictive drugs? All right, so let's go back before farming, before the Neolithic Revolution. So what did humans do? They were scouring the earth for good things to eat, right? And we tried an awful lot of plants, right? And people who were up in the hierarchy probably had told other people to try the plants, and they wanted to see what happened to them. And humans found a number of plants that they really liked. Wasn't broccoli. Okay, so the opium poppy, right? In Asia, psychostimulant is a fancy term, but the original one is cocaine, so coca leaf in the Andes, and then we have synthetic ones like amphetamine now. Nicotine, the tobacco leaf, the fermentation products of grain or of tubers like potatoes, and alcohol, ethyl alcohol, and then the cannabis, the marijuana plant. So, what is the difference between opium and broccoli? So here's what we've discovered. Every one of these plants is a chemical factory, right? And some of these chemicals may be just to the plant waste products. Others may actually, and certainly in the case of alcohol, this is not a plant working, this is yeast, and it is a waste product. But we know, for example, coffee isn't up here, and by the way, I'm down to 20 espressos a day. It turns out that caffeine is an insecticide, so maybe some of these things actually evolve for other purposes. You can spray a caffeine solution maybe in organic gardening. You might follow up. I don't know if it's still used, but it is an insecticide. But at any rate, all of these turn out to be Trojan horses. Well, all of them had made a chemical that looks enough like these brain communication chemicals, like neurotransmitters, that they fool the brain. Okay? So we'll come back to this in a second. Let me just show you, I can never resist showing a few chemical formulas. Okay. So this is a picture of dopamine. And all you have to do, can we have a quiz? All you have to do is just see there's this ring, phenyl ring, and this structure. Here's amphetamine. Looks similar? If you were a protein that hung on to dopamine in the brain, you think you could be fooled? Well, that's what happens. Okay. So here's a nerve cell. This is a nerve cell from the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, that mellifluously, poetically named structure in the brain that makes dopamine. Okay, so a little bit of neurobiology. When nerve cells make these chemicals, these neurotransmitters, they're waiting for the right time to release them. So they store them in these little vesicles, okay? And then a signal comes along. Okay, so for a dopamine neuron, maybe the signal is, it's winter and I just paid a sick amount of money for 5 blueberries at Whole Foods I fell into, and it was delicious, and a signal comes down this nerve cell, and I release some dopamine, okay? But in order to process information, the signal can't just then sit around because then anything would be marked as rewarding, so that the dopamine, these little red dots, actually gets very ecological. It gets taken back up into the nerve cell when it's done doing its work downstream through a protein it's called the dopamine transporter. But basically it vacuums up dopamine and puts it back in the cell where it can be recycled. So cocaine looks enough like dopamine that it actually interacts with this dopamine transporter. But it's not so similar to dopamine, so it gets stuck and it blocks the transporter. So now what happens? Well, now the next time a signal comes, okay, gang, time to release dopamine, the dopamine now is going to sit around, and it's going to be at a higher concentration than it ever was before. And all of the cells, which I haven't shown you downstream, are going to be saying, "Ooh, wow, whatever this is great," right? So if, let's go back here. So, this state will release dopamine, and now the bell will release dopamine. But let's imagine, instead of this natural reward where there's a discrete signal and it ends, let's imagine that this dog has scored some cocaine. Okay, what's going to happen? It's going to have more dopamine in its synapses, in the connections between nerve cells, than it's ever had before, right? And it's going to sit around for a very long time, right? Wow, learn this. That was great. Let's do it again. Let's remember exactly how we did it, right? And it's going to paint anything in the environment. Remember I said at the beginning, people relapse often when they have reminders of drug use. Anything that is associated with drug use is going to get not just painted with motivational significance. I mean, it's going to get shellacked with both, right? Because the brain is being fooled by all of this stuff. A little more neurobiology, or is that enough? A little more neurobiology. So now, when you learn something's really important, it becomes automatic. And what do I mean by that? I'll give you two examples. Let's imagine that you just moved and you're driving your car from work to your new address, right? You are paying attention, right? You're looking at every street, right? You're just really focused. But 2 weeks later, right? Coffee, tuning the iPod or the whatever, right? Chatting, not texting, that's illegal, right? But are you a zombie? Is this so automatic that you're a zombie? No, because if you see a car stop short ahead of you, you're completely awake, you stop. But if nothing untoward happens, you might not even remember that you drove home. Nothing from the trip. I mean, you got home, but you're not thinking about it. Another example. Some of you have been in plays and learned scripts and positions. Some of you are dancers or musicians. Some of you have been pitchers in Little League or beyond, or played a sport. Just think about doing a particular dance, or playing a musical instrument, or pitching or throwing a fastball. It's all automatic, right? What happens if you think too much about it, right? What's the old line? If you think, you stink, right? You might, exactly. If you think, you stink. But again, you're not a zombie, right? If you forget a line and you're a little flustered, you can get right back into it, but it's all sort of automatic. So it's like, it's like, I don't know if anybody still cares about Star Wars, but Luke feels the Force, okay? Well, there's a part of the brain that's specialized for making important, learned, repeated movements automatic, okay? So they leave the thinking part of the brain, the cortex, and as you learn something again and again and again, it migrates into something, it gets encoded, the motor learning is encoded in something called the striatum, right? And it's shown here. Here's your cerebral cortex, the front of the brain, the back of the brain. The striatum's actually, it's hidden, it's deep in the brain here, okay? And this is, and once things are learned in the striatum, boy, are they learned. So when things go wrong in the striatum, lots of things can go wrong, unfortunately. But let me again give you another real life example. Nobody has to admit it, but if anybody was a nail biter, right? Now, there's nothing that anyone likes about nail biting, right? So why can't you just stop it, right? You get these nasty infections, your nails don't look good, your mom paints your nails with bitter, poisonous stuff, right? What is it, right? And we think that one of these overlearned motor loops just basically keeps replaying, right? And you just automatically start biting your nails, and so on for a lot of these kinds of habits. Okay, and guess what? Guess what neurotransmitter helps encode automatic behaviors? Our old friend dopamine. Well, why is that? Because survival depends on being highly efficient. Okay, just think yourself into being, a cheetah, and an antelope is going by. It's just like pitching a fastball, right? The smell has motivational significance. You're hungry, and you just go up, and the hunt is automatic. And for predators, the kill is absolutely stereotypic, automatic, right? They don't think. I mean, we have trouble talking to them anyway, so we never know what they're thinking about. But right? Okay, so in humans, right? So I've told you a lot of things that we do become automatic, but drug seeking and drug taking becomes, right, not only painted with motivational significance beyond anything else, not only does it get prioritized as job one in your orbital prefrontal cortex, which gets dopamine. Drug seeking becomes automatic, and so a cue, okay, a reminder. And it can be a withdrawal symptom, it could be feeling crummy, it could be stress, it could be the smell of drugs, it can be your old friends, it can be seeing a bar, it can be feeling full after a dinner. Whatever cue, right, activates wanting in the nucleus accumbens, but it also activates automatic drug seeking in the striatum. And again, you're not a zombie, right? So if somebody's out trying to buy drugs and it happens there's a policeman standing on the usual corner, they don't actually walk up to the policeman usually, unless it's really messed up, and try to do a drug buy. But they stop themselves. But then what happens when this gets interrupted, right? Is that that's when they get intense craving, wanting, needing, because this sort of automatic gratification is interrupted. So now, again, what we hope is by understanding all the chemicals and so on, we're going to get better at coming up with treatments. And frankly, right now there are some, but they're not great, and so still interventions like AA and cognitive behavioral therapy and teaching people to avoid cues and reminders is really good and useful. But we all know that there are lots of people who don't get better, and we really do need better treatments, because this really destroys lives. Whether it's the most common problems are tobacco and alcohol, because they're legal, but these things destroy lives. So we really have to exploit this knowledge and this chemistry to do better. But it also tells you something about the power in vulnerable people. Not everyone who tries these drugs gets addicted, but you don't know who you are ahead of time, right? And not everyone who gets addicted has as much trouble as the doctor I told you about stopping. But this explains some of the sometimes mysterious, the power that drugs have. How is it that a plant product can come to control behavior? And it tells you that with an addicted person, you even though when somebody relapses, it's exhausting, and people want to lose patience, but people are set up to relapse because the brain holds on to these things, and so you just have to be implacable, again and again and again and again, and ideally not in a blaming stance, but implacable about helping someone to get treatment and understanding how frustrating it is. So why don't I stop there?